Hey everyone, it's Aspen, your host for Forestry Talks, a podcast that explores all things forestry in Alberta. I'm really excited to be here on site at the Banff Fairmont Springs Hotel for our 82nd annual general meeting and conference. We've got a ton of great guests here. There's so much networking. We're having a great time, and I'm really looking forward to bringing some of those guests on this show for you to listen to. So stay tuned. We're going to have a great week. I can't wait to share it with you. Welcome back, everyone. We're so excited to be continuing on with our special AGM and conference series at the beautiful Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel. I'm so pleased to be joined by John Desjarlais, the Executive Director for the Indigenous Resource Network. And before we get into the show, John, I just first really like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Aspen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Love the work that the AFPA does. Couldn't make the event last year. Super excited I was able to make it work. I made a point to make it work and to come out and participate.
Yeah, well, and we were so pleased to have you. Mm-hmm. I heard one of the comments after your panel is that it was the highlight of the entire conference. So, I mean, lots for us to chat about. But First, John, if you want to maybe just share a little bit about yourself and then the Indigenous Resource Network.
Absolutely, yeah. So personally, I'm Cree Métis, Neenau Métis, the N dialect Swampy Cree from northeastern Saskatchewan, and Cree. We refer to it as Kaministigo Minayagaskak, which is Island of the Trees, Island of the Big Trees, Cumberland House. And so a historic community from a colonial perspective. 1774 is the oldest existing community in Western Canada. Wow. The first inland Hudson Bay trading post. So from that perspective, a lot of history. But of course, from the Indigenous perspective, it's been a culturally and a sustenance important region for thousands of years. And so, absolutely proud to call it home. It's where my maternal side is from. And paternal is from southern Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, John. And tell me a little bit about the Indigenous Resource Network.
Absolutely. And so the Indigenous Resource Network is a network of Indigenous people that work in the industry, either for the industry or indirectly through supply chain, through businesses. And so we stood up the network, and I say we, a collection of Indigenous people that participated in industry and thought, how do we... more so, there was a frustration. We saw this sensationalization of Indigenous participation in the media. And, I thought that's not our experience. That's not a lot of people's experience. And is that moving things along? Or is it causing issue and delay? And how do we get, to respect Indigenous people, to value Indigenous people, to highlight all the incredible examples? And so we thought, let's organize around it. Myself having, up to that point, having about 20 years in the natural resource sector in a variety of roles. I have an engineering background, operational, health physics, environmental, entrepreneurial, business development, and knew so many people with that level of experience. And so how do we leverage that? How do we be useful to society, to our communities, but also to industry as well too? And so we organized around that. We built a network off of a survey. We thought Indigenous people, we felt anecdotally supported industry. We've seen these polarized examples in media, and so let's poll, let's survey. Yeah. And so we organized a third-party survey with a credible organization, and we surveyed Indigenous people, and that's, what affirmed our anecdotal belief that a majority, 2/3 of Indigenous people supported resource development. That doesn't mean to say 1/3 was against, about that 20-25% were on the fence. And then there was a small minority that were against resource development. But more so, it gave us the opportunity to dive in and inform our strategy. It was like, how do we, understand what the social license looks like? How do we support our people and move things along and move things forward?
Yeah. John, you beat me already to my first question, which was going to be to chat about the polls. So I love that you were already able to weave that in. Yeah. And I think it is, really important work to showcase actually how communities do feel about the sector. And I think something that's also really interesting is that forestry, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the industries that has some of the biggest Indigenous representation in the workforce.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's incredible representation in the forestry sector and right across the value chain. There's diverse participation and representation. And so, right from some of the, supporting on the labor side, on the harvesting side, all the way up to the management side. And so through that 10 years, and then that value chain all along the way, we see ownership, entrepreneurship, we see participation, Indigenous people that are participating, that are, not just that are industry, right? And so are part of industry, included in industry. And it's really exciting. We spoke a little bit this morning about there's such a good cultural and values fit. This industry is a industry on sustainability, and it's a renewable resource. It has to have a long-term outlook.
Yeah.
And so that outlook, of course, serves the interest of Indigenous people because, that 7th-generation thinking. How do we progress as people with that long-term view sustainably, right? Focusing on community wealth versus kind of individual private wealth. And so, there's a good fit, thus, I think, good integration, thus good inclusion. And I don't know if you could really truly say there's Indigenous people and industry. I think Indigenous people are industry, and industry is Indigenous people. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love, one of the things that you touched on in your response there was about values and the shared values. And I think it's been really interesting throughout the conference and some of the conversations to hear how we can explore how those different values connect. Like there was a discussion earlier, of course, about, different like holiday time, for example, in the workplace. And it's like, well, we all have, time that we need to take away to be with our family for our respective celebrations. How does that fit into the workplace? And it's kind of maybe just looking creatively about we share actually these values. So how can we, respect and honor that in the workplace? So maybe can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Like, that's one of the things I'm pretty passionate about in terms of leave, right? In terms of, having balance and finding balance and leaning into our community values. It's really interesting, labor code, especially around leave, things like bereavement, I find so fascinating. Yeah. And so built off of an idea of a nuclear family, that we're not supposed to care about anyone and grieve out of anyone that passes away from our immediate family. In the Indigenous community, there is no real nuclear family. Yeah. And so we are just as close to, multi-generation and to, cousins. Our families are so connected, kinship. Yeah. And that's not unique to Indigenous people. There's so many non-Indigenous families that are very communal in that respect as well too. So that, of course, that spills into other areas in terms of leave for ceremony and sustenance, right? And so there's recreational, but there's very important things that are important to people's culture and to people's livelihood and to people's identity. And does the workforce support? And because we distill everything down, and in business we distill everything down to dollars and cents, right? And so there's a cost of doing that. Yeah. But we're not very good at saying what's the cost of not doing that. Is that person much more productive and engaged if we're meeting their needs as individuals? If we're fair, right? It's not about exploitation and getting every unit cost or every bit of productivity out of that person that we think we're owed. What do we owe that person, right? Yeah. This has got to be more relational, less transactional, and we've seen it. I've had the it's not unique. I've had the privilege to be able to lead and support people, and then when you gave them that freedom, and your productivity is objective and outcome based, and not going to micromanage and not going to care where you are. It's incredible what those people are able to produce when they get that support and that freedom. And a supporting workforce is much the same thing, right?
Yeah. So. Absolutely. And, so one of the common themes that we've heard come up in a number of the conversations throughout the entire conference was about when you want to make sure that people are feeling included in the workplace, you do that by talking to them and figuring out how, what actually they need. Like that doesn't come from me saying, John, I want to make sure you're included in this workplace. This is how I've decided that's going to work for you. It's going to be like, John, how can I include you better? So with the work that IRN does, connecting with the Indigenous workforce, what are you hearing about Indigenous inclusion in the workforce? Like, and what are maybe some of the asks or the desires?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, one of the things that So in terms of inclusion, recruitment, and retention, one of the things that are coming out that are an incredible best and wise practice is there's, these communities, and so communities of support. And so how does organizations facilitate supporting Indigenous peer networks within their organizations? So as an Indigenous person, I walk into an organization. One of the first things is I want to be able to identify. We heard that this morning: identify and relate, and role model, mentor. So I want people with common experiences like me, and I want to connect with them.
Yeah.
And even better, that I can connect with them in my organization and whatever industry I'm working. And so we're hearing wherever those coordinated, facilitated peer networks, whatever industry like industry peer network groups, whatever they're called, where companies support, the gathering of Indigenous people, and then empower those networks to say, okay, what does good policy look like? What is good recruitment and retention?
Yeah. And
instead of that paternalism, right? Let's hear from our Indigenous people who the policy impacts.
Yeah.
It's for that group. So let's. And then, where there's even some authority for that committee or that group, which is exceptional in terms of how they engage with the company back on all those different strategies and tactics and policies, procurement. I think we're hearing and seeing that's, a wise practice, right?
Yeah.
In terms of inclusion, in terms of involvement, in terms of engagement. And it's working.
Yeah. And absolutely. I think that's a really powerful example. It's something that I've heard as well before. There's actually a summit that I attended probably 2 years back, Workforce Forward Summit. It's an Indigenous Inclusion Workforce Summit. And one of the panelists was from post-secondary. And so she was talking about how they were really worried about being able to retain Indigenous students during the COVID pandemic and what that kind of disconnect was going to be able to create. And so what they modeled was they started setting up basically Zoom visits, virtual visiting with all the Indigenous students and staff, and coming together and just, sharing a meal or, whatever that may be, and how that kind of really created a community and kept everybody engaged in the school. So I think there's so many great examples of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Anywhere we, say it's important that we, facilitate you connecting with people with common experiences and support you, and then, and empower that group and say, okay, how can we be better?
Yeah.
How can we support you? Active listening, right? I think things where you see that it's working. It's making a difference, right? It's making an organization much more included. Indigenous people feel more engaged and then thus productive.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So, of course, we just got you fresh off of a panel about economic reconciliation. John, I'm wondering if you can share with me what were maybe some of the big themes that you really wanted to get across in that conversation?
Absolutely. And so there was a lot of exciting things discussed about that panel. One of the pieces that was a theme around a lot of the conversations topics is the education and awareness piece. Like, why are we doing this? Why is it important? Do we understand that historical and current context of Indigenous people, that lived experience? Are we understanding and appreciating and empathizing with that lived experience, right? And where Indigenous people are carrying a lot of this socioeconomic trauma and baggage, and that of course influences engagement and productivity and well-being. So that was not intentional, but that also sits, and people, we need to understand, there's some real important social reasons and the truth before reconciliation, and reconciliation, is often said. But out of that, okay, what are some of the, advantages, competitive and business advantages? And, we heard Shanna and myself, we both talked about, partnership and equity and divestment of resources, and, looking at relationship different, and looking at, things like land tenure and forest tenure, and looking at businesses, and, how do we include Indigenous people in more meaningful ways, achieve reconciliation and economic reconciliation. But what are there's merits much past the right thing to do, the just thing to do. There's good business here, really good business. Things are changing. And so, and so that was quite of a common theme. Yeah. And then talked about partnership, just that relational piece. It's about prioritizing the relationship, and then the transaction follows, right? Transaction follows the relationship, and have a healthy relationship, a rewarding relationship, and you will see productivity, you will see bottom line, you will see all those good things. But and then understand those differences, and and recognize and value the differences and the strengths, and come together on more equitable terms. And and it was, I think we heard some pretty positive comments in regards to that.
Yeah. I'll never forget, it was one of my very first podcast interviews on the Forestry Talks show. I interviewed JP Gladue at our AGM, and he shared that Indigenous partnerships are Canada's competitive advantage. And I feel like I'm hearing that a lot from you and from Shanna as well. Like when it comes to, we need to look at these partnerships with community as a huge business opportunity. Huge,
and great role model and mentor of mine as well too, and JP, and absolutely. We want to be able to develop resources. We want to develop sustainably. We want to expedite development. We want to get products to market. We don't do that going around or over Indigenous people in Indigenous land. We do it through and with Indigenous people and through that land, and absolutely, and leaning into that is that competitive advantage, right? We can get things to market quicker. We can, it's no longer managing risk through community. It's about leveraging partnership and relationship. All those influence, that competitive advantage, right? And it becomes, that's again what we talked about in one of the themes. It's a business. It's a big business opportunity.
Yeah.
And the more we lean into it, I think the more we influence bottom line, we make more money. And again, we can demonstrate to the investment community, to the public, that we have incredible relationships in these sectors, in the forestry sector. There's equitable benefit, and you get that support. Policy reflects that support. Investment reflects that. You see greater investment in development. And so it's a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah, no doubt. And so I thought, great conversation on the panel earlier. I thought it was fantastic that the panel essentially pose a challenge to the room, saying, we want you to think bold about how we can, work together and dig in here. And so then one of the follow-up questions was, well, how do we think bold? What does that look like? So John, maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Being bold is about taking chances, but taking chances on ourselves, like understanding our own privilege, our own bias, and then challenging some of those things, doing things differently. Setting those targets, procurement targets, employment targets, and pushing to achieve them. A lot of times, I think we do those things and not truly understand them. We set those policy goals and then we ask people to operationalize them without ever truly explaining why are we doing these things. And so, I think we need to, again, be bold, lean into that, set that high target, right? Just like, we don't have anyone on our board that's Indigenous, let's recruit an Indigenous board member. We don't have anyone in our senior management that's Indigenous. Let's actively recruit and find someone competent, capable. There's incredible Indigenous people out there. Let's recruit and place in that. Let's change policy. Let's have a more inclusive policy in terms of leave. Being bold means we don't necessarily need to understand that fully, but we keep hearing it's important from the Indigenous community. Let's implement it. Why do we need to truly get it and to truly understand it? It has merit and it's important to this group, and that group is important to us, right?
Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of ways we can be bold.
Those are great, really great recommendations, John, that I hope, folks that are going to listen to the show can maybe take that away. I'm wondering if there are maybe any examples that you've come across, either in Alberta, Canada context, that folks can look to as this is something that this is a business case that we can learn from and maybe apply those learnings back to our own workplaces.
Absolutely. So examples, business cases. again, I'll plug our documentary we did here, Stewards of the Forest, and we visited two incredible communities. We visited the Squamish, and Enchikai developments. We talked to incredible people. Roger Lewis, I just absolutely love with that guy. Incredible in terms of what he's doing. We spent time in Meadow Lake, talking to those businesses. Meadow Lake's an incredible example of how a community and a number of its ownership communities can get vertically integrated and laterally integrated into the sector in terms of all the different value pieces, and how they've done that competitively and fully integrated and incredibly involved. I nerded out. I'm an engineer, and touring their biomass facility, touring their entire facilities and touring their biomass, but seeing they were so excited about some of their technological innovation and some of the stuff that we're doing. So there's an incredible example that Indigenous communities and people can capitalize, are capable, and can run profitable businesses right across the value chain. You go into a place like when we were in Squamish, and talking to Roger and the team there, an incredible example of how forward stewardship and they talked about things like prescribed burn, and they talked about selective management, and it's really exciting. And again, individuals that have such a long history in forest management and development, and Indigenous people have been doing it and leading, and there's incredible value there. There's a lot to be learned from these two incredible examples, and there's so much more examples across Canada of exciting things that are happening, and I think we can learn from, we can emulate to some respect, but also recognize that there's a lot of value to incentivizing, rewarding, and then of course there's that return on investment from the incredible contributions of the communities and organizations and people like that.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up wildfire, because I was going to ask you, and you might have to help me out with this one, because it's been a little minute since I've seen it now, but if I'm not mistaken, after the 2023 wildfire season, Indigenous Resource Network and FPAC, Forest Products Association of Canada, co-wrote a bit of an op-ed about, what's going on in the forest with these wildfires. So can you maybe talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's controlled areas that were, that are being managed, and so we're struggling to be able to apply kind of that adaptive management practice where we can thin out and we can select, and then the prescribed burn techniques that we talked about. There's a lot of challenges. Conservation looks differently. We want to say, okay, we can't do anything to this area. Well, it's natural to harvest and to thin out and to pull out because things look different, the world looks different, and so that was an important piece to say that we need to get much more active. We can't. We're creating huge risk when we're leaving a lot of dead timber and dead mass, and we're getting that thickening of that underbrush and whatnot, and we're creating these fuel sources, right? It's really important to understand that we gotta manage these much more actively and manage that risk, right? And in light of all of the world's challenges right now, and it was important to be able to talk to it and to talk about how Indigenous people are advocating, saying much the same thing, right? And so we didn't just leave things, and we moved and migrated, harvested, and to ensure the migration of animals and plant species and stuff like that. And we have to manage them, right? We have to actively manage them. We can't just sit back and do nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. So John, I'm curious, over your time with IRN, how have you seen the conversation change when it comes to Indigenous leadership, whether that be as it relates to wildfire or other areas of the sector?
I see a greater appetite and desire to include that perspective, to include that knowledge, include Indigenous knowledge, thought leadership. I see, a growing desire to be bold and to challenge what inclusion looks like, targets, procurement. I see things changing and changing at rates greater than I've probably ever seen them change before, which tells me that there's, Canadians are taking responsibility for, its past relationship with Indigenous people, and things are progressing.
Yeah.
Things, there's ways to go, but we're making, and people should get the credit that they deserve. There's a lot of incredibly good things happening. Indigenous people are getting more opportunity. They're getting recognized. They're getting valued. From a different perspectives and getting included in much more meaningful ways. Businesses are being developed. Assets are being divested and offered. Opportunities for Indigenous people to own and to invest is still trending and fairly new. So it's changing for the better.
That's great to hear. And I love to be able to highlight that because I think, one, it's important to showcase what is happening, but two, I think it also challenges us all to do better. It's like, okay, look, this is happening. We can do this too, right?
Yeah.
And we can do something else. And, it challenges us all to kind of...
It does. Yeah. Like we IRN loves to tell good stories and good, right? And so merit value-based stories. And then we love to dive a little deeper and showcase the social value of why this isn't so important. And then, of course, there's the business value, but like, why is this important for the social value, and how does that come back full circle for the business value? And we're really excited to kind of celebrate that, right? And I think, like you mentioned, what we like to do is, we say this, we like to positively shame, industry and governments to do better, right? Wow, that's a good, look at that example, right? What are we doing? We're not doing the right thing, right? Yeah. We could be doing better. And so in much more practical, pragmatic, and positive ways, we hope to influence that. So
absolutely. Well, John, this has been a ton of fun. Any final thoughts that you want to share? Any kind of key takeaways that you want folks to have after they listen to our conversation?
Oh, wow.
Tough, I know.
I know, right? Again, one of them, I love the way Canadians are taking responsibility for this relationship, and really leaning into the social value, but also say that we're kind of past the social reasoning for engaging in truth and reconciliation. It's a development and it's a business imperative now. It's if we don't lean into it, it's where are we going to get our workforce? Fastest growing demographics, jurisprudence is changing that favors Indigenous people and communities. Investment in public and international sentiment, that favors that social and then that local impact, right? And so leave with that. This is. You figure how to do this and how to do this well, and it becomes a competitive advantage. Yeah. So
fantastic.
Awesome.
John, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Aspen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Forestry Talks, a podcast that explores all things forestry in Alberta. If you're curious to learn more, check out our website, albertaforestproducts.ca or loveabforest.ca. I'm your host, Aspen Dudzic, and I'll see you next time.
This series is proudly produced by the team at Road 55. Road 55 creates content that connects. For more information, visit our website at road55.ca.